No God But God is a popular history of Islam from its origins in pre-Islamic Arabia to its development under successive empires and nation states right up into the future. And it also talks about some of the misconceptions that people have about Islam, where it came from, its beliefs and practices, the complexities of its theology, and most importantly, its diversity. I think that there is an impression that Islam is a very monolithic thing, that it's just one way of being a Muslim. But in fact, Islam is probably one of the most diverse religions in the history of the world. And the diversity of faith and belief and practice is something that I think doesn't get enough attention. And finally, it does address the issue of political Islam, modern Islam, the problems of religion and violence, and makes predictions about where Islam is going into the future, about it becoming much more individualistic, much more fragmented, sectarian, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, that kind of fragmentation will likely lead to even greater pluralism and relativism. One of the things that I'm most proud of is the early chapters of the book, because although it's true that often people think that the history of Islam starts with the Prophet Muhammad in the 6th, 7th century, the truth is that unless you know the world in which the Prophet Muhammad was born, then you can't really understand the influences that gave rise to his preaching and his revelation. So it actually goes back much, much earlier, really starts in about the 3rd century AD in the Arabian Peninsula. It talks about the tribes and the culture that arose. And I think the importance of that is that we have a tendency to think that that religious leaders, prophets, messengers, that they just come out of nowhere, that they just suddenly appear one day, and that they invent these religious traditions. But Jesus didn't invent Christianity, he reformed Judaism. The Buddha didn't invent Buddhism, he reformed Hinduism. And the same way, the Prophet Muhammad didn't invent Islam, he took the multiple religious and cultural traditions in which he lived and he reformed them. He created something new out of them. But if you want to understand what Islam is and where it came from, you have to understand the world out of which it arose. Islam, of course, is one of the 3 Abrahamic religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all look to Abraham as the father of their religious traditions. Islam especially sees the Gospels, or the New Testament, and the Hebrew Bible, or what is sometimes called the Old Testament, as part of the living tradition that gave birth to the Quran. I mean, those books of the Bible are mentioned in the Quran, that the sort of prophecies that began with the first human being, Adam, according to Islam, continued right to the seal of the prophets, the Prophet Muhammad. So in a sense, Islam, coming last of these 3 Abrahamic religions, in some way sees itself as the conclusion of them, the completion of them. Not, as I think so many Muslims nowadays believe, that Islam did away with those other religions, or that the Quran did away with those other scriptures. The Prophet Muhammad never said any such thing. The Prophet Muhammad saw himself as completing the prophetic biblical tradition that started with Adam and went to Moses, Abraham, Jesus. And completing them doesn't mean negating them. It means seeing them as a finality, as a totality. As a scholar of religions, I've learned that, on the one hand, to take faith very seriously. I mean, I think a lot of people in my profession see faith as something to be discarded, that you need to use reason and science and history in order to understand where religions come from and how religions evolve. I don't think that way. I think that you have to understand belief and where the sort of the idea of faith arises in order to truly understand the power that religion has to transform people, to transform societies. So for me as a scholar, it's not that I excise faith from my scholarship. I try to bring it together and make sure that while I am being rigorous in my scholarship and in my research, nevertheless make room for the place of faith in the development of religion and the way that I talk about religion. I think the story of Islam is the story of all great world religions. It's a story of a constant evolution. Islam today is not what Islam was 100 years ago. It's not what Islam was 1,000 years ago. In every place in the world and every time in the world, Islam has been experienced differently. And in that regard, what I want to emphasize most about Islam is that despite what even Muslims themselves say, there's nothing exceptional about Islam. There's nothing extraordinary, nothing special, nothing unique about Islam. It is the same kind of religious experience that comes in so many other varieties, and it has gone through the same evolution, the same changes, the same influences that Christianity and Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism have had. I think that is probably the biggest misconception of Islam, is that it's different. And what this book tries to emphasize is that no, it's actually not all that different, that it has had a similar trajectory as all great religious traditions have. Well, the most controversial part of the book, of course, maybe the end of the book, where I talk about the Islamic Reformation, the idea that over the last 100 years there has been a reformation process taking place within Islam. Now, reformation, of course, is not a positive or a negative thing. It doesn't mean that it's good or bad. It just means that the process by which individuals, Muslim individuals, are beginning to define the religion for themselves instead of relying on the ulama, the clerical establishment, which has had a monopoly on the interpretation of Islam for 1400 years. That monopoly is starting to fade. And that sense of individualism, whereby individual Muslims, individual believers are reading the Quran for themselves, interpreting it for themselves, fusing it with their own ideas, whether with nationalism or with democracy or with their own sexual orientation, their gender. That process is what we call the Reformation. And that's the process that has been accelerating over the last century, and especially now. A lot of the problems that we are seeing, a lot of the conflicts that we're seeing in the Muslim world are precisely the result of this Reformation process. Many people are now defining Islam for themselves, and those definitions are starting to clash with other people's definitions. Part of the controversy comes from not understanding what Reformation means. Muslims have a hard time with the term Islamic Reformation because it seems to imply that there's something wrong with Islam, that Islam needs to reform. But that's not what Reformation means. It doesn't mean that Islam is bad and it has to be good. It just means individualization. That's what Reformation means. On the other side of the argument are those Islamophobes, anti-Muslim thinkers who say that there's no such thing as the Islamic Reformation, just look at the violence that's taking place. Or they point to someone like Osama bin Laden and say, well, that's proof that there's no Islamic Reformation. And that's just pure ignorance. Actually, Osama bin Laden is proof of the Islamic Reformation. I mean, here's a man who has had no religious training whatsoever. He's not a member of the ulama. He's never studied the Quran or Sharia or the Islamic sciences. He has no credentials whatsoever to speak about Islam. By law, he cannot issue fatwas, for instance. And yet he would issue fatwas all the time. He would make these pronouncements. He was called a sheikh. He has no sheikh education, no knowledge that would make him be a sheikh. That's precisely what I'm talking about. Here's an individual, an engineer, with no training whatsoever, no education in the Islamic sciences, but who for himself was defining Islam. Now, he was defining it in very violent ways, but nevertheless, that is exactly what I'm talking about. That individualization that we see is part of the Reformation process. Well, I'm an academic by training. I mean, my PhD is in the history of religions, and I did an enormous amount of research and scholarship in writing the book. But I wasn't writing for an academic audience. What I wanted to do was write for a popular audience, an audience that may even know nothing about Islam, one that could be read almost like a novel. I mean, I think of myself primarily as a storyteller, and when you're writing about religion in general, you have to remember that religion is, after all, storytelling. And so I wanted to write this book not just for a wide audience, but I wanted to write it in such a way that really brought out the story aspect of it. That said, it also comes with, about 120 pages of footnotes and bibliography, and so I take that scholarship very seriously, but I wanted to make sure that the scholarship was embedded in the text, that it was hidden, so that the book itself would be very readable.